Training in place versus training out of place. New approaches to auto workshop talent development. Part 2. Continuing our discussion on talent management, join passionate automotive trainer and coach Andrew Uglow as he explores innovative approaches to developing skills in your workshop. In this episode, you'll learn the difference between training in place and out of place. Discover how microlearning can transform your team's capabilities and understand the 3 R's of successful talent development. Along the way, Andrew shares some great stories, including a fascinating parallel between medical facility cleaning processes and workshop training methods. I'm your co-host Anthony Pearl, and this is the Frictionless Workshop Podcast. Let's get cranking.
The business pays for the technician to go to training to learn this stuff so that when they come back to the business, it's all about production. It's all about effectiveness, efficiency, all those sorts of things. And we measure it. It's all about the numbers. It is, I hate to say it, but it's a financial game. And so lamenting that someone doesn't know it, well, okay, bad, but the flip side is this is a financial cost.
Yeah, it's a real problem, isn't it, within this, kind of idea of talent management, because when is the right time to manage it so that they do know it, to recognize they don't know it, to manage it so they do know it, and do it in a way that doesn't impact learning on the job.
Yeah. So the challenge is, and this is something that I think is shifting, or arguably has shifted in the industry, but I see that there's still some room for it to move, is the concept of training in place versus training out of place. So they could talk about TIP, training in place. So this would be, we use phrases like microlearning. We use phrases like gamification, all these sorts of things as a way of capturing small incremental learnings that people can do whilst they're working on the car or in between vehicles as a way of filling in the gaps of that learning triangle. All right. So for whatever reason, whether it was the individual, whether it was the learning organization, whether it was the content, for whatever reason, people who've got a gap, yeah, they should know, but they don't. And so how are you going to resolve that? Because at the end of the day, that gap costs you money. And just as importantly, that gap could kill someone. This is not a small, trivial detail. The flip side of that is that gap is stressful for the person that has it. Like, no one stands up in front of a room full of people and go, oh, look, actually, I'm a bit of an idiot. I don't know this, and I don't know this, and I don't know this. I'm not really sure why you employed me, but hey, thanks.
You also don't know what you don't know.
Right. And of course, you don't find out until you're facing a problem, and you look for a way to fix it, and you don't have one. You just go, and so now you're scrambling, right? So you might ask, which would be a useful thing to do, but they're busy, you're busy. There's all this pressure to perform, to get stuff done. You're on the clock. You've got numbers to hit. This is not a trial run by any stretch of the imagination. And so, now what do I do? And so the whole idea of training in place, I think, is something that needs to be developed further. I think in businesses, we get fixated, and not without cause, we get fixated on output. And there's that's a whole nother podcast. Maybe we can talk about that as part of this series, but we get focused on output, and the output is a consequence of the things that are happening upstream. And so if you don't address the things that are happening upstream, well, your output is funky. And so the whole idea of training in place came from some work that I did for a colleague of mine. I have a friend, he runs a mechanical fitting business. I'm not sure if I've mentioned it before. And he needed some people who could stand upright, maintain a pulse, and handle a spanner. And I qualified. It was fascinating work. It really was fascinating work. It required a fair amount of attention to detail, but it was not brain surgery by any stretch of the imagination. There was still a level of skill. And so they were working in the medical field, and in the medical field, everything is about cleanliness. There's Australian standards to comply with. There's, in addition to good practice and all that sort of stuff. And so everything is very process driven, both at the production of whatever the medical facility is producing and in terms of shutdown work. So they would shut down, and there would be a process for shutting down, and then there'd be a process for the shutdown works, changing out components, and then there would be a process for powering up. And for the most part, where we were working, they used a process called clean in place. And so there would processes for cleaning these enormous vats and pipes and components in place because they're just simply too big to move. And so we kind of have the similar situation where we're so busy. We've got all this customer demand. We've got all of this number to hit. And not just make money, but in some cases it's a matter of survive. We're not dealing with small trivial things here. And so the concept then of train in place rather than just clean in place, train in place. How do I do that? How do I do that better? Of course, the opposite of that was clean out of place, or COP. And I remember sitting in the briefing room and they were talking about the different components, and they had this machine called a cop washer. And I'm not sure whether it was just the fact that it was early morning or I don't know, but I heard something else when they were talking about the cop washer. And they kept talking about this cop washer. And basically it's a dishwasher the size of an elevator, and it's clean out of place. So they put all this stuff in these enormous racks, feed it into this enormous dishwasher, and they spray all manner of chemicals and hot water and all that sort of stuff to sterilize the different things. And then they pull them out, dry them off like it heats to crazy temperatures. And then they pull them out and they're sterile and ready to use in the various processes that they use. And they kept going on about this cop washer, and I'm hearing something different and I'm a little bit confused. And they sort of go, "Oh, Andrew, you can work on the cop washer." And I've gone, "Oh, okay. Can you tell me what a cop washer does?" And they're going, "Oh, it cleans a whole bunch of small little bits and pieces." And I'm just going, "Well, that doesn't really help me." And I said, "Why is it called a cop washer?" And they said, "What did you call it?" I said, "I called it what you called it." And they go, "It's clean out of place, COP." And I've gone, "Oh, COP, right. That clears up a lot for me. Thank you very much." And they were all confused. "What were you hearing, Andrew?" "I was hearing cop washer." Yes. And so at present, the industry largely does training out of place, right? So we take a bunch of technicians from a bunch of different businesses and we bring them into a training environment, which is super useful. It allows us to do things that we couldn't do in the workplace. It facilitates people making mistakes and having the opportunity to meaningfully learn from those mistakes outside of this pressure environment of hurry up, how much longer. It's better that you make a mistake on a component, a transmission, an engine, or whatever it is that lives in the training center that isn't live in the customer's car, because now you haven't caused $6,000 worth of damage and someone has to pay for it. Now, sure, there's damage to training, but training has a budget, right? Training is facilitated to address those sorts of things. Whereas Anthony, you would be thrilled if someone goes, "Oh, look, we had our apprentice working on your car and he smoked your control module, let all the smoke out of your engine control module. It's going to be $6,000. Sorry, we'll just add that to your bill." You'd be going, "Yeah, nah, that's absolutely not. That's your mistake. You fix it." And so this is the reason that we do training out of place, right? And at the same time, I think businesses need to meaningfully and deliberately start to look at, let's do training in place. Maybe not to the same scale, but you can do micro lessons. You can do learn from error. You can do, I like to call it preventative learning. So this is where, rather than waiting for someone to make an error and then correct them, let's see if we can catch that on the front end. It's going to cost me a bit of time, but I don't have the consequence. And so is it worth investing in that? I honestly believe that it is. And this, of course, then gets back to the quality of your people. Are they capable of doing, as in terms of leadership, your foreman, your senior techs, are they capable of teaching people to do a training in place? And I'm talking like 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe at the outside 10. Are they capable of doing that? Because if they're not, well, how do you do it? How would you facilitate that if you don't have the skill in your business? And so I go back to the whole question of talent management. Like, talent has a cost. And so you have the cost of either developing your talent, or conversely, you have the cost because you don't have the talent.
The Frictionless Workshop podcast is brought to you by Solutions Culture. For details on how to get in touch with Andrew, consult the show notes below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Now, back to the podcast.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because there are many work environments where this whole concept of having an intern is there. And so exactly of that, that is a managing talent over a period of time to make sure they do know stuff. And if they do make mistakes,
Right.
there are people around them to catch the mistakes and to instruct them as to what they're doing, as they're going through a process. So it's interesting that that is something that is recognized in other industries,
Yeah.
but perhaps not as, in fairness, some of those are, like medical profession, there's a period of time before they don't just walk you out of university and say, okay, you're a GP now,
Here you go.
go do your best.
Open heart surgery, bro. You're up.
Yeah. But yet, in a sense, with the car, that can happen, right? You're out of TAFE, go fix the engine.
We see this in automotive industry, and talking to people who had a different experience at a different time. So they've been in the industry for a while, and our learning was very different to how learning is done today. And you had to demonstrate that you knew it before they'd leave you alone to work on a car. Whereas today, the challenge is, the description is the skills shortage. Not only can't we find people, but finding good people is even harder. So, someone described the talent pool as being very shallow and evaporating rapidly. And that isn't far from the truth. And at the same time, I think that if that is the case, if that's the environment that we're in, well, then we need to have better methods for developing talent than we're using presently, because the methods that we've been using for the last 40, 50 years, and things have changed. And that adage, that saying, you can't use old keys to open new doors. Yeah, maybe we need to do it better. Maybe we need to do it differently. Maybe there's different skill sets that we need in the business that simply were unnecessary years ago. And the flip side is, we see, I know in certainly in the dealer world, but also in aftermarket, we see, a ratio of 1-3, 1-5, where there is one qualified person for 5 technicians, 5 apprentices. And that isn't inherently a bad thing. And at the same time, it certainly comes at some risk. And I think for a lot of businesses, they play the numbers. As in, we'll get away with it more often than we won't. And when we won't, we'll just cop that one, try and fix what went wrong and move forward. And that is a strategy. Is there a better way of doing that strategy? I honestly believe that there is.
I imagine there's 2 different extremes here that you can look at. On the one hand, you've got a youngish technician who comes in and hasn't seen in practical terms, hasn't seen older cars and the old style engines from, 50, 60 years ago. And then on the other extreme, you might have some of the older technicians who really aren't au fait with the new modern versions of things. And somehow you have to manage that talent of what people don't know. And ultimately,
how do you find out what they don't know until they put to the test, right? Which is the whole point of learning, right?
I think in the end, just to give them a bit of an action plan at this sort of point in time, what in an overall sense can you give them and I know particularly you've got your resourceful technician formula that we've talked about in previous podcasts. What's the way of thinking that people need to change in order to address this idea?
So I love the 3 R's, and I know my grandparents used to talk about reading, writing, and arithmetic, with being the 3rd R, which is fair, but I refer to them as resource, recognize, and reward. It is profoundly harmful and I'm going to argue malicious to expect someone to perform a task when they don't have the resources. And so whether that is they don't have the special tools, they don't have the hoist, they don't have the space, they don't have the whatever it is physically, or whether they simply don't have the resources mentally, they don't have the knowledge or the skill, to demand that of them, whether they should or not, to demand that of them, I think is profoundly harmful for the person. And the consequence of that is for the business. So you've got to resource them physically. So they have to have the physical things that they need. So if you're going to do work on a particular type of vehicle, well, it has to be done on a hoist. Doing it not on a hoist is just wildly harder and time costly and all that sort of stuff. Will take longer, and to expect the performance without giving them the resource, I think, is profoundly wrong. And so that step 1 is, do they actually have what they need to do this task? Yes, no. And if you're not sure, check, find out, test. So you've got the physical resources, then you've got the mental resources, which is the knowledge, skill, ability, attitude, all those sorts of things. And you go, well, gee whiz, that's a lot to install. You can do for individual tasks, you can do micro installations, as in you can give them just the bit they need just for that job, just in that moment, if they're in a state to receive that. And there's the skill. The second thing is recognize. We're very quick to pick up on when people do something wrong. Oh, Andrew, you peanut, what were you thinking when you did that? Oh, Andrew, you're taking too long. Oh, Andrew, this. Oh, Andrew, that. And it's like there's all this criticism, or if you like, negative recognition. Where's all the positive recognition? Hey, Andrew, well done on that job. Good work. Hey, Andrew, you did that perfectly. Keep that one up. Hey, Andrew, really pleased with how you did this job. People, what gets recognized gets repeated. And so rather than just having moments and doing the dummy spit and they should know when something gets wrong, well, why don't we flip that? Why don't we do the inverse and recognize them for the things they do well?
Thank you for listening to the Frictionless Workshop podcast. For details on how to get Andrew working with you and your technicians, take a look at the show notes. There's also a link to some special content you can access. I'm Anthony Pearl, reminding you to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.